Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. It is impossible to ignore the influence of Virginia during colonial times and during much of the first century of the United States of America. So much of the nation's early history and identity is rooted here, including the first British colony at Jamestown, when the revolution against the British crown turned to open hostility, and then a military resistance. A son of Virginia led the ragtag colonial army of patriots fighting King George's redcoats. General George Washington, following his final victory at Yorktown in Virginia, went on to become the first president of the United States. Four of the first five presidents were Virginians, including Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the 1776 Declaration of Independence, and other prominent Virginians who participated in the creation of the founding documents. Seven of the first dozen chief executives hailed from Virginia. Then, when the Civil War came, Virginia left the Union and became the center of gravity of the new Confederate States of America, with its capital in Richmond and its leading general, Robert E. Lee, a Virginian in the mold of Washington. Though Virginia's influence waned following the Civil War, its history tainted with the burden of slavery, the leadership role it played in the nation's early trials and tribulations is undeniable. This brings us to the portrait of the young man pictured here. Though his name is currently lost in time, he is connected to Virginia's colonial past, even though he posed for this photograph during the 1860s, more than 80 years since the colonies became an independent and sovereign nation. So, what do we know about him? We do know that he posed for this image in the 1860s because the photograph is a carte de visite, a French format that found its way across the Atlantic to America as the storm clouds of war gathered over the land. This small image, about the size of a modern trading card, is a paper print mounted on cardstock with two thin gold lines framing the border. You can just see them here. It was a common style used, from about 1862 to 1870, or perhaps a year or two later. Notice also that the edges are clipped. This is a telltale sign, evidence that someone cut the corners with a pair of scissors to make it easier to slide it, the photograph, into the very thick and unforgiving pages of photo albums without creasing the actual photographic print. We also know of his relationship, even though we don't know his name, we know of his relationship to Virginia's colonial past, partly because of his clothing. Check it out. He wears an elaborate jacket, which appears to be velvet, with a plated front with small ornamental brass buttons in groups of two and decorative trim on the sleeves. A matching sash, also velvet, is wrapped around his waist and covers his pants, with thin stripes on the side sliding into tall boots. His soft cap is topped with a reddish purple tinted plume and a conspicuous horseshoe pinned to the front. A second horseshoe of about the same size is pinned to his shoulder above the heart. The horseshoe is mentioned in an inscription along the bottom of the cardstock mount. You can barely see it here, but it's written in period pencil. It states, "Knights of the Golden Horseshoe." Well, that's extremely valuable as far as clues are concerned. The Knights of the Golden Horseshoe dates to Virginia's Shenandoah Valley in 1716. In late August or early September of that year, an expedition of about 50 men on horseback, led by Alexander Smallwood, the colony's lieutenant governor and a British Army officer, happened. Here's a picture of Spotswood. He set out to explore the interior of Virginia. The expedition was composed primarily of white wealthy colonists and their servants, soldiers, and Native Americans of the Meherrin Indian tribe. The expedition began in the town of a German settlement named Germana, which is located about midway between Fredericksburg and Culpeper. The group headed west, riding up and over the Blue Ridge Mountains and down into the Shenandoah Valley, finding a great body of water we know today as the Shenandoah River. They named it the Euphrates after the great waterway in Western Asia with ancient connections to the Bible and other stories. The expedition lasted about 2 weeks and involved as much sport hunting and casual drinking as exploring, at least according to the journal of Lieutenant John Fontaine of the British Army, who accompanied the expedition. When it was all over, the expedition returned to the more settled part of Virginia with satisfaction at having partied along the Euphrates and christening a pair of mountains named for Lieutenant Governor Spotswood and King George. This takes us to this marker here. It can be found along the Skyline Drive, where it is believed the expedition crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains into the valley. The exact route is not known and has not been mapped, but it is noted as one of the earliest journeys into the Shenandoah Valley region by settlers of European origins. The marker recounts how the horseshoe became a symbol. There's a statement engraved on the marker. Governor Spotswood gave his companions a small golden horseshoe because their shoeless horses had to be shod for the mountain journey. In 1877 history of Culpeper, Virginia, remember that's near where the expedition began, it recounts how the golden horseshoe became a symbol of the expedition. It goes like this. Spotswood, that's Lieutenant Governor, instituted what he called the Tramontane Order in commemoration of the expedition, each gentleman being entitled to wear the golden horseshoe who could prove that he had drunk His Majesty's health on Mount George. It's one of the two mountains they christened. The golden horseshoes descended as heirlooms in several families. According to one autobiography by a man named Brooke, it speaks of one in the possession of Edmund Brooke, whose ancestor was part of the party of folks who made the expedition. The gentleman died in Georgetown, a district of Columbia, and we had hoped to find the relic in his daughter's possession, continues the Culpeper historian, but it had been lost. Another individual, Campbell, speaks of the late Mrs. Bott of Petersburg, a descendant of Spotswood, who writes that she had seen the miniature horseshoe belonging to Spotswood and that it was small enough to be worn on a watch chain. Spotswood probably had more than one of them, the historian continues, as we find it said in another manuscript that when Spotswood made a treaty with the 5 nations of Indians at Albany in 1722, in which they bound themselves not to pass the Potomac or the Blue Ridge, the governor told the Indians that they must take particular notice of their speaker and gave him a golden horseshoe, which he wore at his breast, and bade the interpreter tell him that there was an inscription on it which signified that it would help him pass the mountains, and that when any of their people should come to Virginia, they must bring it with them. So the horseshoe was used not only to celebrate the expedition, but it was also, according to this history, it was given to Native Americans as something of a pass to be able to go outside the established boundaries that they agreed to live inside. The story of the Tramontane Order and the horseshoe symbol passed down through the decades. In 1845, an action-adventure story by a man named William Alexander Carruthers titled The Knights of the Horseshoe a traditionary tale of the cocked hat gentry and the Old Dominion, was well received by the public and praised by reviewers as an important work of Southern literature. It originally appeared in a Savannah literary magazine called The Magnolia, and then it was published in a 2-volume book afterwards. When you consider the 1845 publication date in context to this photograph, this young man was likely a little boy when the book was published. He may have been a veteran of the Confederate Army. There's our Civil War connection, who formed or joined a fraternal order during or after the Civil War to commemorate those who journeyed through the wilds of Virginia, crossed the peaks into the Blue Ridge, and rode into the verdant valley of the Shenandoah, with Governor Spotswood forever remembered as the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.